Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about square roots. Basically, over the next couple days, we're going to be really getting into all these different things with square roots, like simplifying square roots, using them to estimate square roots, a whole bunch of different things. But before we really start diving into that, we want to make sure that we are all on the same page about what a square root is and what are some of the vocabulary and things I need to know about a square root. So that's kind of what we're going to go over today. So for a square root, what are we really talking about? Well, we've already heard of squaring a number before, right? And that's a number times itself equaling something. So we know like 5 squared equals 25 and negative 5 squared would also equal 25. Well, a square root is basically the opposite of that operation. Instead of saying, hey, when I multiply this number by itself, what does it equal? It's what number times itself equals what's underneath my square root. So when I see the square root of 25, I would say, all right, what number times itself gives me 25? In this instance, I could say it's either 5 or negative 5, okay? Now, there are a couple different definitions I want to go over. First off is that when you're finding a square root, you're going to technically almost all the time get two different answers. There's going to be a positive answer, which is your principal root, and you're going to have a negative answer, which is your secondary root. Now, you'll see as we go along here, we normally don't include both answers when we're answering a lot of these questions and when we're talking about square roots. We usually kind of defer to the positive, or if they put a negative out front, we'll refer to the negative, okay? And some of that also has to do with the kind of equations you solve to have that come up. And so we'll kind of see that as we go here, okay? But a square root, technically, you have a principal and a secondary root, a positive and a negative root, okay? Some other vocabulary to know, the radicand, that's the number that's inside the square root. So for instance, this 25, that's your radicand, okay? That's your radicand. The radical symbol is that square root symbol. We technically have more than just a square root, right? You could actually have radicals of different types. You could have a cube root or a fourth root where instead of it being what number times itself, it's what number times itself, or things like that. Okay, kind of like how we could have different exponents. You have different roots, that'll be the opposite. We're mainly going to deal with square roots. That's kind of be our focus here. But just to know for the future, you could see some radical symbols that have some different indexes that tell you different things about them, okay? Now, a perfect square are really, really important numbers that you've probably heard of before, but we're going to make sure that we remember those, especially today. You're going to need to know your perfect squares a lot because those are numbers that are the square of an integer, okay? They're the set of numbers that are a square of an integer. All right, I just want to show you really briefly what our first 10 perfect squares are, some of the things you want to look out for in terms of perfect squares. So this is a set of perfect squares. These are the first 10 perfect squares. And why are they perfect squares? What makes these numbers special? Well, they're actually the numbers that are integers multiplied by themselves. So 1 is 1 times 1. 4 is 2 times 2. 9 is 3 times 3, so on and so forth, all the way up to 100 is 10 times 10. So that's why these are the first 10 perfect squares. And what's important about these is that when we are talking about square roots and when we're square rooting numbers, these are some of the numbers we're really going to be looking for because when you square root them, you are going to get a rational answer because you're going to get an integer as your answer. The square root of 100 is 10. 10 times 10 gives you 100. The reason why we want to call that out specifically is that most numbers, okay, all the numbers that are not perfect squares are actually going to give me, and as I click back through here, they're actually going to give me these things called irrational numbers. Okay, irrational numbers, as you remember when we talked about our number sets, are numbers that we cannot write as a fraction. And they show up a lot when we're talking about perfect square, or we're talking about square roots. When we square root a non-perfect square, we're going to end up with an irrational number. When we square root a perfect square, such as 25 or 36 or 81, we're going to end up with a rational number, okay? So we want to make sure that we're looking at these and we kind of identify if this is a perfect square, I should get a nice rational number. If it's not, it's going to be some sort of gross irrational number that goes on forever and doesn't have any sort of pattern to it, all right? One little note to keep in mind here is that 0 only has one root. The root is 0, okay? So when you see 0, there is no primary and secondary, or no principal and secondary root. You're just going to get 0 as your answer. Now, all positive number roots will have a positive and negative square root. Usually when we're identifying that, we're going to use this symbol, which I call it the plus or minus symbol. But basically it means, hey, we want the positive and the negative root when you give us your answer. Okay, so here's 3 different examples here. I have the plus or minus square root of 144, the square root of 16, and the negative square root of 16. Okay, for the plus or minus square root of 144, I'm actually asking you for the primary and secondary root, so you'd list me positive and negative 12. When I just say the square root of 16, I'm actually only asking for the primary root, and when I say negative square root of 16, I'm only asking for that secondary root, okay? So when you have to give both is when we put this plus or minus in front. If you don't see that, you kind of just give us whatever sign you see as your answer, okay? So if you see only a single square root indicated for those. Now, one thing to keep in mind, now look at this one, square root of negative 16, this one down here. Can you square root a negative? You actually, right now, we're going to say you can't, okay? When you square root a negative, you're going to get, it's actually what's called an imaginary number. It's not real, okay? But we'll be getting to that later in your math career. You'll be talking about those. But when we look at it right now, all we're going to say is, do you know what? Not a real number. We're not getting a real number there, so we're not going to worry about it. I can't do the square root of negatives at this time, all right? So anytime you see a negative underneath your square root, you can say I'm not going to get a real number. If you see it out front, we're looking for that secondary root. If you don't see it, primary root, the plus or minus. I want both roots, the positive and the negative, the primary and the secondary, okay? We're going to do kind of a little bit of a quick fire here. I'm going to give you all a couple roots, and I want you to tell me what those roots are going to equal. Either give me the primary or the secondary or both, okay? Now, these are perfect squares, so think about what the square root would be. No calculator. You're going to look at this without a calculator. So, like, for example, the first one, I look at the square root of 4. It's not asking me for the primary and secondary root, so I'm only going to give the primary root. So that is, in fact, going to equal, we gave them all the answers, okay, but that is, in fact, going to equal 2. Go ahead and try 4 and 5, and then we'll go over the answers if you didn't already see them. We'll go over those answers, and then we'll come back and make sure we're all on the same page. So go ahead and do that for me, pause the video, and then come back and we'll talk about those. All right, so you should be back with me here. We have the square root of 4 is 2, as I said earlier. The opposite of the square root of 49, this is asking for that secondary root, so it's going to be negative 7. And then negative square root of 9 is going to be negative 3. Again, these are all perfect squares, so they have nice integer answers as their square roots. Okay, how about these ones right here? Can you guys think you can go ahead and try these? Go ahead and see if you can think of what those square roots are going to equal. Take a pause the video and make sure if I'm asking for a primary, secondary, or both, you're able to give that to me. All right, welcome back. Let's go ahead and let's look at these. So for the first one, I'm asking for the primary and the secondary. The square root of 1 is 1, so it'll be plus or minus 1. For the next one, I'm only asking for that primary root, the positive one, so the square root of 196. Actually, is a perfect square. It's 14 times 14, so 14 is going to be our answer. Plus or minus the square root of 121, that's going to be plus or minus 11. Again, that is another perfect square. It's 11 times 11, and we're asking for both roots. And then finally down here, this one's going to be plus or minus 50. Now, this is not necessarily a perfect square that I'm going to ask you to remember. However, you do know that 25 is a perfect square, and seeing the 2 zeros here should kind of give you a hint that, oh, yeah, it's going to be 50 times 50 that gives us that answer, okay? All right, so that's kind of our practice here on primary and secondary roots, okay, and thinking about what a square root means and what it is, okay. Remember, we're looking for those perfect squares. I showed you guys the first 10. We'll kind of look at some more of those as we go here and what these perfect squares are, okay, but make sure you can identify your primary root, your secondary root, and definitely what kind of root am I asking you for, okay, based off what you're seeing, what am I asking you for. All right, thank you all for watching.